The traveller had come to rest in the rocking chair. The clumsy folds of his great fur-lined overcoat stood round him like a box, while a number of scarves tangled under his chin. His tight-skinned, Chinese yellow face seemed to glow, incandescent in the light of the nursery fire where we made beef-dripping toast together. Even this warming occupation could not persuade him to remove his overcoat. "You'll catch your death of cold when you go out," my nurse would always say. "Not after Siberia," the traveller would always reply. It was a ritual. Of all the lands he had known, his own, Russia, seemed to me the most fabulous. He was from Moscow, a Muscovite, he said, but later I was to learn he was of Tartar blood, and unmistakably the Tatsy or Mongol hordes had stamped their imprint on his strange countenance. The dark slit eyes, the pointed ears, the bald Chinese bald skull, the slight yet cruel smile which sometimes passed across his usually impassive face. All these spoke of Asia, of the Golden Horde and the limitless horizons of Central Asia, where he roamed in spirit and in fact. Whenever he came to Europe, he would visit us, and then, reaching my nursery, sit beside the fire, his huge shadow spread-eagled, a double-headed Russian eagle to me, across the rosy wallpaper, shrugging and gesticulating with odd, unexpected movements, his long, bent-back fingers cracking. The nail of one little finger sprouted to astonishing length. He would spin a marvellous web of countries, cities, people and things, conjuring for me a world of shimmering images. Fishing for serpents in the lakes of Central Asia. How pomegranates, which at that time I had never even seen, were said to contain one seed from Eden. The sort of food Mamai the Tartar ate, sitting in his brocaded, fur-lined tent. The trumpeter of Krakow. The private lives of reindeer. His grandmother's house in the Ukraine, where the vast entrance hall was paved like a chessboard in squares of blue john and jasper. Along with an amber chaplet, which he fingered abstractedly, the traveller always carried a squat little agate spoon. "For my caviar," he said. "It tastes so much better from a spoon." He never met with this delicacy at our table, unless he brought it with him, which he sometimes did, appearing unexpectedly with a lavish pound of the great grey-grained beluga kind. "Fish jam," cook called it, sniffing suspiciously, but I took to it from the first. Sometimes he told me fairy stories, Russian legends, Ilya Muromets the heroic, or Konyok Garbunok, the little hump-backed horse who brought his master such good fortune, or the magical cat, chained to a tree, who sang verses when he circled to the right and told fairy tales when he went to the left. Best of all, he would tell of the great train that ran half across the world, the most luxurious and splendid train that ever was, the Trans-Siberian. He held me enthralled then, and today, a lifetime later, the spell still holds. He told me the train's history, its beginnings, first mooted, it seemed, by an Englishman, Mr. Dull by name. Howard Tsar had said, "Let the railway be built," and it was. He told me of its mileage, 5,000, to the Canadian Pacific's 3,000, of its splendours, brass bedsteads instead of bunks, libraries, hot baths and grand pianos to while away the hours, of its miseries, of prison wagons, iron-barred trucks hitched on at some wayside halt where the shackled lines of wretched creatures could be heard clanking their chains and singing their traditional exile's begging song, the Milosernaya, a sort of funeral chant of doom and despair. "How did they learn it?" I asked. His face changed terribly. Another mask of pure hatred suddenly succeeded the habitual one of Asiatic impassivity. "Those who went on foot Sometimes took over a year to reach Tumen, not even halfway, he said. 2 miles an hour, 20 miles a day was good going in chains. They had plenty of time to learn the begging song. And to learn how to suffer and die, he added. He shrugged. Life teaches. It was one of his favourite dictums. And then, wrenching himself from Siberia to London, he became suddenly autocratic. More tea, he demanded, and I hurried to the teapot. How I loved him. How I loved his traveller's tales and the way he brought the Trans-Siberian Railway thundering through the house. There was a chapel on the train, he said, a candle-lit, icon-filled chapel where the long-haired, long-bearded Orthodox priests gathered the pious together before a gilded iconostas, praying and swaying as the great engine snaked across the steps. Piety ran the length of the train. Piety and patriotism, love of a country. As the train rattled across the bridge over the Volga, every man stood up and doffed his cap to Mother Volga. I knew it all by heart. Every Wednesday and Saturday, the Trans-Siberian train pulled out of Moscow, and for 7 days ate up the eastward miles to Irkutsk, and further into the heart of Siberia, through the Transbaikal provinces, edging the Mongol steppes and the yellow dust clouds of the Gobi Desert. There was a branch line to Outer Mongolia, another along the Amur to bandit-infested Manchuria, and at last, 10 days later, Vladivostok, Russian outlet of life and death on the Sea of Japan. One extension of the line led to the Forbidden City. The gates were scarlet lacquer, 150 feet high and stuck with the heads of malefactors, said the traveller, spreading beef dripping with a lavish hand. For me, nothing was ever the same again. I had fallen in love with a traveller's travels. Gradually I became possessed by love of a horizon and a train which would take me there, of a fabled engine and an imagined landscape seen through a pair of narrowed eyes set slantwise in a yellow Mongol face. These Asiatic wastes were to become for me the landscape of my heart, that secret landscape of longing which glides before our eyes between sleeping and waking. From the first, the traveller had understood my infatuation for Asia, and every time he came to see me he brought some object which told of those horizons, a chunk of malachite or a Kazakh foxskin cap which smelled rather rank, and once a bunchuk, or standard, decorated with the dangling horsetails of a Mongol chieftain. I was enraptured. Nasty, dangerous thing, said Nanny, holding it at arm's length and depositing it in the umbrella stand. Why can't he bring you dolls dressed up in national costumes? You could have quite a collection by now. But the traveller knew better. Siberia! I'll give you Siberia, you with your chilblains, said my nurse when I whined to go out in the brown-edged, slushy London snow. I was hardening myself in preparation for journeys to Omsk and Tomsk. Later I named 2 kittens after these towns, and the mysterious, icy-sounding places along the Trans-Siberian's way. Verkhne Udinsk, Chita, and Chayalorgol were names round which the tempests of Asia howled. Nevertheless, Nanny, who had now left us, showed an understanding of my peculiar passion, and next Christmas sent me a purple-bound volume, a come by chance off a barrow in the Portobello Road, entitled On Sledge and Horseback to the Outcast Siberian Lepers, by Kate Marsden, New York, 1892. Must have been all for a rocker, said Cook, when I read her the more dramatic passages. Moreover, she was adamant in her refusal to make pelmeni, pieces of stuffed pasta, a celebrated Tartar dish of which the traveller had given me the recipe. Staple Siberian diet, he said. Filthy, but filling. He also added it was very hard to make. Which is as may be, said Cook darkly, basting the roast in a crimson glow of professional complacency. Nor was she any more cooperative when I dwelled on the habits of Genghis Khan's troops, who were required to carry a sheep's stomach full of desiccated dried meat, and another of powdered milk flour under their saddles, thus being ever at the ready to gallop off on some foray. "But it would only be like getting a haggis," I pleaded, when she refused to supply a sheep's stomach. I had planned to attach it to my tricycle, and thus provided pedal furiously off down the path to Asia. As my obsession gained in strength, it coloured everything and, to my mother, appeared to distort my education, whereas, in fact, it merely developed it in an unusual direction. The houses of Plantagenet and Stuart were meaningless to me beside those of Rurik or Romanoff. America's abolition of slavery in 1862 was for me only an echo of Russia's liberation of the serfs a year earlier in 1861. Some odd numbers of the Penny Cyclopedia, published by the Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge, 1837, promised infinite bliss, for to me 1837 was a fatal year, that of Pushkin's duel and death. But there was no mention of the dark drama in the Penny Cyclopedia, and when I complained of this omission to my father, he merely suggested I should start my own Society for the Diffusion of Useless Knowledge. Changeling, he called me, when I enlarged on my obsession. But he spoke with comprehension, for he too loved Pushkin's tales, and also lived withdrawn in his own world of reveries, immobile for the most part in a bluish haze of his favourite tobacco, the daylight of daily life, filtered fitfully through a heavy Moorish mucharabia he placed across the window of his dressing-room. The tone of my school reports was disquieting. "Seems to be daydreaming, oddly lacking in team spirit, moody, secretive," were recurring phrases. The headmistress, a majestic figure hedged with self-importance, who was occasionally glimpsed sweeping down the corridor, her academic gown billowing in the blasts of fresh air to which we were so ruthlessly exposed, was more specific when discussing me with my mother. "A child of my age," she said, "was not expected to know about anything so specialized as the Old Believers sect. A grounding in the Old Testament would be better. Nor should I interrupt the history lesson on Queen Elizabeth to ask about Tsar Ivan's matrimonial intentions. It was simply showing off. I spent far too much time in the library and was always trying to get out of games and gym, and how regrettable it was that I had refused to be confirmed, really quite outside the headmistress's experience." My mother had nothing to say to this, for she too had found my obstinacy incomprehensible. All the girls of my age group were being prepared for confirmation that term. Some pompous talks were given by visiting clergy in preparation for the ceremony itself, conducted by a bishop of the Church of England. But I had taken a stand, and flatly refused to be received into the fold. It would be orthodoxy or nothing, I told my mother, who for once lost all control and boxed my ears. "This was just another example of my wilful nonconformity," said the headmistress. "No team spirit," she hissed, and my mother wilted at this dreadful taunt. And then, to cap it all, I had chosen such a particularly unpleasant subject for my half-term essay. "Did my mother know of this?" asked the headmistress sternly. But on learning it was the assassination of the mad Tsar Paul I, my mother breathed more freely. All night long the Trans-Siberian raced through the nursery, past the rocking chair, and through the rose-patterned walls it sped on its way, carrying me into the steppes, to Omsk and Vera Andreevna's birthday party, where the giant sturgeon, adorned with ribbons, dominated the feast. Wearing my white party dress, I was just taking my place at the table, when a door banged somewhere downstairs, and I woke, hurtling back through space, to see the wavering red glow of the lampada swaying gently before my icon. just as it had been doing in Vera Andreevna's room. I turned over and went back to Siberia, to blizzards and wolves, and a highly coloured tale I had much enjoyed lately about a noble-hearted Siberian lad who rescues the beautiful but priggish daughter of an émigré French aristo turned dancing master in Irkutsk. Alas, Fyodor is but a serf, and Geneviève is a haughty patrician. Between them the social gap looms as large as any fissure in the ice floes over which Fyodor leaps to snatch her from the arms of a polar bear. Although the niceties of social distinctions were something of which I was not then aware, I relished the story for its local colour, and thought Geneviève soppy as she wept and swooned her way through the book. Didn't she know how lucky she was to be on the Siberian ice floes with a handsome serf and a polar bear? I lay in my warm London bed and wished ardently that her lot might be mine. Oh, Siberia, Russia, Russia. The last thing I saw before I slept was a pinpoint of light swaying before the shimmering silver casing of the icon which the traveller had brought back for me from Moscow. We never discovered where he was when he was not among us, for he was an adept at sidestepping questions. The Arab saying, "Conceal thy tenets, thy treasure, and thy travels," might have been his. We had heard he was in some way connected with the export business, but exporting what? Slaves? Biscuits? Guns? And from where? To where? The combinations were limitless. My parents inclined to believe he was a secret agent, particularly now that war was on us. Agent provocateur? Double agent? They breathed the sinister words unwillingly. For? Against? We were never to know. They loved him in spite of themselves, accepting his comings and goings like the flight of some strange bird, a rather disturbing creature whose eruptions into their life brought drama, colour, and confusion. I loved him unreservedly, for his strangeness, and for the climate of danger that I sensed around him, as adventurer, and as the man of whom, even unconsciously in my earliest childhood, I had been desperately aware. So, loving him, I loved his background, everything that had surrounded and formed him, and I sought to penetrate that enigmatic and remote limbo land of the Slav, where I felt my roots had been planted in some unfathomable past. It seemed I had always known and loved him, and in his world I would at last come home.